Hello, hello. It is Thursday, June 18th. This is Moral Scrupulosity, Volume 2. As always, we want to let everyone get situated and come in the room. And so let us know that you're here. Say hello. Let us know where you're from. And we will get started in the next 90 seconds. Not to be overly specific.
Ethan, how's the weather in Florida these days?
I don't know. I'm in Georgia.
I don't think he's in
Florida.
Florida.
You're in Georgia. Oh, you're in Georgia. Never mind.
I hear it's sunny during the day and dark at night. Yeah. No, it's fine. It's fine actually. It's a little warm, but a little humid. How are things in Chi-Town?
Yeah, fine here in the Wisconsin, Illinois area. A beautiful day. Finally, the weather is getting nice. So.
And where you are in your neck of the woods?
Fine.
Mr. Hershfield?
Yeah, it's been pleasant. No complaints.
I mean, I like to come on here and have some. Go ahead.
I haven't left this room in like 3 months. I see it out from the window, but it looks good out there.
Yeah, I have a window here. It's like that's how I tell how it is outside.
Yeah, we hear Jon, Patrick, and I always like to live stream small talk. It's very important.
Yes.
So, hi, Eric in Houston. Good to see you, buddy. Hi, Peter is in Boston. Mike is in Virginia. Crystal is in Dallas. Hey, Crystal, how are you? Mike has a question, which we will get to shortly. Thanks for the question out of the gate. Appreciate it for sure. Again, if
it's a very specific question, by the way. So.
It is a very specific question.
Well played.
Thank you.
So, if you're just joining us, please say hello. Let us know you're here, and we would love to give you a shout out and say hello. And with that, I think we're a few minutes in, so let's get started. Yep, sorry, just finishing up, pretending to be busy. Okay, and now I'm done pretending to be busy. My name is Ethan Smith. I'm the National Ambassador for the International OCD Foundation, which, as I always say, means I have OCD, and I like to talk about it. This is Moral Scrupulosity, Volume 2. Which means volume 2, which is French for 2, which indicates that there was a volume 1 prior to this, and you would be correct. If you see them out of order, this will not ruin the beginning for you. So they can be viewed exclusive of one another.
It'll just look like our hair got shorter.
Yeah, our hair will go backward.
We'll see if the sequel's better than the original.
Yeah, right.
Got about an hour or so to determine.
Oh, Mike was a joke. It's a joke based on what you said. I get it. So I try not to read questions assuming that they're jokes or sarcastic, because in the one time I'll do it, somebody was like, I was being serious, and then I'll get in trouble. So we don't want that. But I always appreciate humor, Mike. So quickly, let's get through some housekeeping, and then we will jump right into things. This town hall is intended to serve as educational content and is not intended to replace therapy. For treatment-related questions, please be sure to work with your local provider or contact a local clinician. The International OCD Foundation is not a crisis hotline and should not be used if you are in distress or feel unsafe. If you are in a crisis or you are ever feeling suicidal or unsafe, please go to your local emergency room, call 911, or call the Suicide Prevention Hotline at 800-273-8255. There's that graphic. We'll let that sit there a minute. As always, we ask you to be respectful and kind. We try to create as safe a space as possible. It is worth pointing out that this is a public forum. This is being recorded. This will live on the interwebs for all time. And so, however, we are here to support one another in all things and all conversations. And we know that lots of sensitive questions are asked, so we try to be as respectful and kind of everyone as possible.
Sorry about that.
No, it happens occasionally. You know, eat a lot of dinner, that can happen. So with that, Jess, we can drop the graphic, and let's go ahead and introduce you to our panelists if you don't already know them, and we'll go from there. So to my left, right, over here, it's always reversed. Oh, I did it right the first time. Is the magnificent Jon Hershfield. He's a psychotherapist in Maryland, the director of the OCD and Anxiety Center at Shepherd Pratt. He's the author of Overcoming Harm OCD and When a Family Member Has OCD, and the co-author of the Mindfulness Workbook for OCD and Everyday Mindfulness for OCD. And I think he's also working on a couple projects as well, probably having to do with OCD. Jon, thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me. It's good to be back.
You were locked into a 2-volume contract, so you didn't really have a choice.
That's good.
Yeah.
That's why there's mindfulness and everyday mindfulness.
That's right.
Yeah. Exactly.
I'm waiting for every other day mindfulness.
Oh, I like that. I like that. Every other Thursday mindfulness.
Which is what I generally practice in my daily life.
Mm-hmm.
I forgot where we were. I was already thinking about the future. Below me, we have the incomparable Dr. Patrick McGrath. He's a licensed clinical psychologist in the state of Illinois, Michigan, and Missouri. Dr. McGrath specializes in the treatment for anxiety, OCD, and PTSD. He has given numerous presentations on the treatment of anxiety disorders, OCD, and PTSD. He is the co-author or author of numerous peer-reviewed journals, articles, and also has authored a book on OCD, the OCD Answer Book, and a stress management manual. Don't try harder, try different. Dr. McGrath currently serves as the head of clinical services for No CD, which we will talk about later, leading their teletherapy services across the U.S. to help people with OCD. He is a lead psychologist at Amita Health, where he opened intensive outpatient, partial hospital, and residential treatment programs for anxiety disorders, OCD, and PTSD. Patrick is a member of the scientific and clinical advisory boards of the International OCD Foundation and a fellow of the Association for Behavioral and Cognitive Therapies, and the president of the OCD Midwest. Patrick, thank you for joining us.
Absolutely. Good to be here.
So with that in mind, we are here for Moral Scrupulosity Volume 2. I think there's lots to talk about around this particular conversation. But if you did not join us for Volume 1, just quickly, I would like to define what moral scrupulosity is. Dr. McGrath, take a crack.
Sure. Well, it's a differentiator from kind of what we think about with religious scrupulosity, which very specifically focuses on if I offended a god, a higher power, or done something to maybe ruin my afterlife. We look at moral scrupulosity along the lines of, in my everyday interactions with people, did I do something that might have bothered them, offended them? Did I somehow come off the wrong way? Should I review my conversations or my actions to see if maybe I did? What kind of amends do I then need to make to people in order to apologize and ask forgiveness for those things? And of course, you could see how OCD could take all of those things to the nth degree.
Jon, anything to add?
Well, all kinds of OCD tend to center around this notion of good enough, right? Are my hands clean enough? Is the stove, really off enough? And moral scrupulosity is really characterized by, am I good enough? Am I a good enough person? And the uncertainty around our beliefs, how we treat people, just our sort of station in life, in the bell curve of morality to immorality. Am I squarely in the middle? Am I all the way to one side? Am I on the part that I don't want to be? These are the concerns that people with moral scrup tend to struggle with.
Actually, may find a way. Go ahead, Jon. Patrick.
I was just going to say, and Ethan, the thing that I liked how you reacted when we talked about this last time was taking a look at all the different types of OCD, how there can be an underlying moral component to all of them. So if I didn't wash my hands enough and then harmed someone because of that, what kind of a person am I, right? And so there can be moral aspects to those types of things. So,
yeah, I kind of had the realization that moral scrupulosity was kind of hanging about under all of my different subtypes and symptoms in some way. And honestly, now that I think about it, not to carry over from last night's conversation, but we did a wonderful town hall on grief and loss, and we talked a lot about shame. And I think shame comes into moral scrupulosity a lot, and how this idea of so much shame accompanies grief. And so, I mean, as we're talking, I'm thinking about this tether between, especially right now, sort of this grief and loss about either the past or the future and what we're missing because of COVID or other things going on. And this idea of shame and really judging ourselves morally for the things that we've done in the past that may not have an opportunity to fix in the future, or the things that we're not going to get to do in the past that may direct. I'm not sure what I'm getting at, other than that I think there's correlation between moral scrupulosity and sort of what's happening in the here and now and our fears about the future. Does that make sense, Jon?
Yeah, absolutely it does. And I think now is an especially challenging time for people with moral scrupulosity, because there's a sort of combination of factors. there are a lot of moral questions happening out there, and by out there I mean out in the world, in the political world, in the world of civil rights, in the world of justice. And then there's also a lot of limitations, a lot of things that we would normally do to distract ourselves from our unwanted thoughts and our philosophical quandaries, like getting ready for work, for example. You don't factor that into how much that can actually help with your OCD. So people are spending a lot more time in their heads, in their homes, and a lot more time on social media, engaging with subjects that are laden with moral quandaries. So if you already struggle with moral obsessions, you not only have more kind of obvious things to worry about, and also more time and less distractions to ruminate on them. So it's just a difficult time.
Absolutely. Before we're getting a lot of comments on lagging. We had this last night too, and we're not sure. It was a bunch of Facebook. So a couple of things that helped last night. You can always try refreshing. If refreshing doesn't work, if you're on your phone, like close out of the app and then reopen the app and come back to the link. If all of those things, if you're on a computer, close your browser and shut it off and then come back on. And if any of those things don't work, you can always switch over to YouTube, which Jess, if you wouldn't mind putting the YouTube link to the live stream. And that's so Kelly, I don't know what's going on. We'll check it out. So Kelly just commented that connection is more stable on the Peace of Mind Foundation FB page. It is being broadcast on Peace of Mind as well. So so hopefully that will help you. Sorry to interrupt, John. Yeah, it doesn't lag for us for some reason. Or maybe it's just when John talks. I don't know.
Right. I'm the one who lags. So.
So we will give everybody an opportunity to kind of process. So yes, Eric wrote, I think this is the perfect time to talk about this, and I couldn't agree with you more, John. As always, I wanted to encourage everyone to ask lots of questions. I really want to do as much Q&A today as possible. I know last time we were here, we had tons of questions, and they were all really excellent. We couldn't get to them all, so we can, we definitely have some things to talk about, but we can start a little early on the Q&A. So I'm also stalling a little bit till people kind of get resettled and kind of go ahead, John.
You guys ever see the movie, the Kentucky Fried Movie?
Love that movie.
Fantastic.
It's a great spoof movie. I was thinking about how with moral scrupulosity, you're always feeling like something bad's going to happen, or like you're always doing the wrong thing. There's a great scene in that movie where the hero character is in the enemy's lair, and he's trying to get help from this woman who he's trying to save. And he keeps making reference to what their plans are going to be and how they're going to escape. And as he's making all these comments, she keeps pointing out all the little bugs and microphones and ways in which the bad guy has been listening to them. So she keeps telling him to be quiet, and he keeps saying things that are going to get them in trouble. And she's the points to this. And right at the very end, when they're like, well, we'll never have enough weapons to get out of here. And he says, oh, that's just not a problem. I can get the weapons. And then he remembers, and he pulls his microphone down from the ceiling and goes, but it would be wrong. and puts it back up. And that's kind of, it just got me thinking about how, it seems like with moral scrup, like there's always an eye or an ear out for the mistake that you haven't made yet. And it can really get to absurd levels, which made me think of that movie.
It's actually one of my favorite movies. I love that movie. So if you're young or 35 or younger and you've never heard of it, Kentucky Fried Movie, highly recommended. Very funny film. So actually I want to ask both John and Dr. McGrath, we can start with Patrick, looks before brilliance. So what are you
confused at how to take that?
and well, I can't use the same jokes from last volume. So what are you seeing a lot in your practice come up for people in terms of moral scrupulosity, and what is the sort of trends that you're seeing right now with everything going on?
Well, it's a lot of, especially with the COVID issue, that I don't want to do something that would pass it on to somebody else. So I don't want to be responsible for compromising somebody else's health. So why not just go ahead and do a little bit of extra hand washing or things like that in order just to make sure that I don't harm someone? Or is it wrong that I don't leave my house at all for the last 3 months? I mean, now our society has all sorts of things are delivered. I don't have to leave. I can have everything just delivered to my house. And yet that was also for someone, I won't even go out on my balcony and stand outside as well too. So trying to get people to recognize where OCD is really coming into this experience and continue with ERP to challenge those types of things and then try to build from there. Because is it also immoral for the delivery person who just brought you your groceries to be outside? Why isn't it immoral for them to be out there, but it would be for you to be out there? And getting to recognize these double standards that OCD sets up in people's lives very often.
John, same question.
Well, I'm seeing a lot of that, and I think that the important part of understanding that, I've heard people make comments like, "Oh, well, there's really no OCD anymore since COVID. You know, what used to be OCD is now normal." And I think that's really really off the mark, because OCD is about intolerance of uncertainty, and so yeah, there have been some changes in the way that we behave because we have to protect ourselves from this virus. But within those changes, there's still uncertainty to tolerate that we don't want to tolerate, right? So you wash your hands and you wear a mask and you follow the guidelines, and there's still uncertainty. You know, have I done enough? And if you attach that to moral scrupulosity, you're talking about something like, okay, I had something like Patrick's example. You know, I had something delivered, and that person was in my driveway, and we were 6 feet apart, and I wore a mask, and then I took the thing. But, you know, would it be wrong for me to think of that as enough? Maybe there's something else I should have done. But, you know, actually, I just really want to go back inside and put away my products and get on with my life. Am I allowed to make that decision to go on with my life? I mean, if I'm wrong, maybe I'll spread the virus. And so this notion of it would be wrong if I decided this is my comfort zone. So now that people are dealing with more flexibility in most of the states, where, you know, now it's not as big a deal in most states to, you know, go out to the grocery store because you just want something and not because you're totally out of food, right? Or to do some social distancing things where you hang out with a buddy, you know, 6 feet apart in your driveway or something like that. There's new uncertainties that we haven't had to deal with before. And this fear of I'm going to handle it wrong, I'm going to handle it inappropriately, is heightened in moral scrupulosity. And then, of course, the other thing that I'm seeing a lot of has to do with current events. The political sphere, just, do I have the right idea? Am I on the right side of history? Am I having the right thoughts? Am I doing enough? If I am doing enough, how do I know that I'm doing enough? If I'm not doing enough, do I need to do more? How much more do I need to do? And these questions, for someone without moral scrupulosity, are just kind of philosophical interests, you know, like, oh, this is interesting, I'd like to learn more. But for someone with moral scrupulosity, it can feel like life or death. It can feel like it determines whether or not I'm a worthwhile person. And suddenly, something that wasn't on my mind is now on my mind because of current events. Maybe I'm not a worthwhile person. What do I have to do to prove with certainty that I'm good and that I'm right? And the pressure that people with moral scrupulosity feel to post something, to not post something, to go somewhere or not go somewhere, to ask a question or not ask a question. It's just really intense. And then, of course, on top of that, many of us are at home just with more time on our hands and more time to be in our heads.
And, you know, really that all or nothingness of OCD says you must be the most moral person in the world, but you happen to be the least moral person in the world. So you've got to do everything that you possibly can to get up to being the most moral person in the world. Yeah,
this issue of I'm not perfectly moral.
Yeah.
Right? There's some moral gray area in me. You know, this is not a perfectly ironed shirt. There doesn't seem to be a problem for me. But if you're to apply this logic to, okay, maybe I'm not perfectly moral, without the OCD, that's not necessarily a problem. It's just an observation. It's just something that is. None of us are perfectly moral. We're all constantly growing. We hope to become more moral. But very few people plan on ever getting to that perfection, right? You see these conversations in religious scrupulosity where someone's trying to be like their Messiah or their deity. But most people who subscribe to those religions don't actually expect to get there. People with OCD often expect to get there as if it were possible. So they spend a lot of time being frustrated.
Absolutely. Thank you, John and Patrick. I want to encourage, again, everybody to please ask questions. We're going to jump into Q&A very shortly. I want to have plenty of time to get to everybody's questions. I'm not skipping questions, but I actually see a comment down below that it was about to a question that I was going to address, which is, Patrick, are you saying, so it's interesting because I think when sort of we were all, at least with COVID specifically, we were all quarantined and everybody was sort of following the same guidelines. I remember the town halls early on, you know, follow WHO, follow CDC, do that, anything else. And almost in a way, you know, as much as a lot of us were triggered with contamination and moral, whatever it was, kind of we were all doing the same thing to a certain extent. And in a way that could have easily quelled some of the fears and discomfort around being moral or not being moral. Now we're in a situation and circumstance where, every state is doing something different.
Mm-hmm.
They're surging in some states, other states are going down. There's all this information floating around. Is that creating even more concern and discomfort around moral scrupulosity because there's not one source to listen to and use as a guidepost?
Oh yeah, I mean it becomes the WebMD of searching for health issues, right? I mean, suddenly now as I do a search for something, I have found 97 different sites that talk about this, and now I have to read all of them. And the only one I'm going to pay attention to is the worst case scenario one, and then believe that one to be true. So that's now what's going to happen with all of this. With what's the COVID thing? That's the worst one, and that's the one that I'm going to believe to be true. So I don't judge decision making based on what politicians say. I'm going to judge decision making based on what experts in the medical field say, which I'm still going to hold to be the CDC, and I'm still going to work on following their guidelines because they don't have any ulterior motives of getting the economy going and budgets and all those kinds of things. They have one motive, which is what's the best practice in order to keep the most amount of people potentially safe. So that's what we're going to follow, is that. If we're going to do an evidence-based therapy like exposure and response prevention therapy, we should follow other medical evidence-based guidelines in these scenarios too, and not base it on what one politician says or what two people disagree about. Or my favorite phrase, they said. And I always ask my patients, well, who is they? And if you can't tell me who they is, I don't give a crap what they say.
But Patrick, the medical organization on Monday said that there was no asymptomatic people, and then suddenly there are again. And oh my God, they were wrong. And those are the doctors you're talking about. What do I do?
I'll take this one.
Yeah.
That's how you know it's science, because when they're wrong, the first thing they do is announce it and then work to correct it, as opposed to say, no, we weren't wrong, and how dare you suggest that we were wrong. That's how you know it's science. Where people with moral scrupulosity, I think, get into trouble with themselves is and you see this even not just with COVID, but just with ERP even. Okay, so I'm going to get an evidence-based treatment for my OCD, but how do I know that it's really OCD and not just I want it to be OCD, because that'll make me feel like a good person instead of a bad person? How do I know that I'm not just glomming on to CBT as the gold standard because it's convenient for me? Because alternatively, I could be this horrible person, and had I gone to a psychoanalyst or something like that, I might discover I was a horrible person, but I'm going to do CBT instead. How do I know that I'm doing it for the right reasons as opposed to just self-preservation? And so sometimes that scares people away from getting the right treatments. In the same way that you'll hear people say something like, yeah, okay, but how do I know the CDC isn't influenced by some politician or does have my back? Maybe I just want to go along with CDC because it's convenient, but if I was a more moral person, I would follow some other person's advice. How do you know? That's uncertainty for you.
Pat, anything to add?
No, I mean, as Jon said, scientists will be the first ones to come out. I think of even some people in our own anxiety field who have retracted their own papers because someone else did analysis and pointed out that they were wrong. And they were the first people to get on and say, you know what, you're right. We were wrong. Wow, what a mistake. We apologize. And we're going to work on correcting that so that we get the right information out. So I know that just like a moral compass constantly moving is annoying as heck for most people, especially for people who have OCD. But OCD is always a moving target. I mean, the moment anyone with OCD feels comfortable in one instance, what happens? OCD says, well, now you got to do this, right? I've likened it to playing Atari. If anyone's old enough to remember Atari, OCD says you have to score 1,000,000 points. Atari only went up to 999,999. You could never actually achieve 1,000,000. And what happened when you scored one more point? It reset back to zero. It's the Greeks wrote about this in the legend of Sisyphus. Sisyphus is condemned for all eternity trying to get that boulder up to the top of the hill, but the boulder is 1 pound too heavy and the hill is 1 degree too steep to make it. And it always falls back down and he's just driven to try it again. And he'll spend all eternity because he was promised if you get it to the top of that hill, you're going to become a demigod. They just played a trick on him that won't ever allow him to do it. And this is what OCD and moral scrupulosity will do to people. You can always do one more thing to be just that much more moral, but you didn't, so you failed, so you have to start all over again.
I think that what people sometimes underestimate when working with clients with moral scrupulosity is the intensity and severity of the pain that they experience when they try to go in the other direction. When they try to stop pushing that boulder up the hill, even though they know that they're never going to get there. When they try to actually just stop in the middle of the hill, sit down and have a snack with, next to the boulder, the experience is, it's sort of like with contamination OCD. Okay, someone on the outside watching someone with contamination OCD touch something that really isn't all that dirty, but to them is dirty, then the person with the contamination OCD is going to feel very dirty, even though there might not be anything on their hands or any reason to think that they're dirty, but they're going to feel contaminated. So with moral scrupulosity, when you're doing exposures, or even when you're not doing exposures, but just not doing all of your compulsions, you're going to feel morally contaminated. But that moral contamination is tied into the same part of the brain that experiences guilt and shame, which is horrible. I mean, it's the intensity of that pain is very difficult to put into words. And to ask somebody to sit with, maybe you're a bad person, to them is kind of like sitting with just like the knife just sticking out of them, be like, it's fine, it'll close up, just hang on, right? But the desperation to get away from that pain is really strong. So when we're constructing an ERP treatment plan, just like it's important to start very delicately with someone with contamination OCD, you need to start pretty delicately with moral scrupulosity.
Because the opposite becomes then, well, if I'm not moral, I'm bad, I'm awful, I'm horrible. And we want people to just kind of take a look at the fact that, no, you're just being like everybody else, who don't spend all day wondering if every action they take is a moral or immoral action. They just, most of the time, go about and just do things. Right?
That makes a lot of sense. I was trying to think. Yeah, I guess it's about living in the gray about it all,
which we ask everyone with OCD to do, no matter what the subtype is. If there's always going to be doubt, and so you may always have doubt about these things, and then are you willing to accept that? And if you are, treatment can be very helpful. But if you make the conscious decision that, no, that is unacceptable, and I will never accept that there can be a doubt about something, then what I've kind of jokingly said then is, well, then please send me your car keys, because I'll take your car from you, since you'll never actually 100% also know if you're going to make it every time you're driving to where you're going to go. If you've decided that doubt is an impossible thing to deal with, you should never drive again after today. Well, I can accept that. That's fine. Well, then, okay. If you can accept out there, you can accept out anywhere else as well too. It is possible.
And people will do some pretty interesting compulsions to get away from uncertainty, to get away from that gray area. Things you wouldn't expect. And most of the time we think of compulsions as things that you do to feel better, but they're actually just things you do to feel certain. And certain is better than uncertain when you have OCD. That feels that way. But that doesn't always mean happier. So a lot of people with moral scrupulosity, when they're in a gray area, will compulsively force themselves to dwell on guilt and shame and really invest in that guilt and shame, not as an exposure, but as a strategy to get away from the not knowing. I know that I punished myself. I know that I hate myself. Therefore, I'm either bad and I've been punished, or I'm not bad because I'm so upset with myself for having done a bad thing, and only a good person would think that way. In either case, I don't have to deal with the unknowing because I know I'm in pain. And that's a really hard compulsion to catch and release, because what would we really ask that person to do? Stop beating yourself up and let yourself be happy, even if you might not deserve it. That's a tall order.
Yep. Absolutely.
I was going to ask Patrick if you had something to add to it.
No, that covered it very well. So.
Okay, cool. You were leaning in. I didn't know. Let's jump to some questions, because we got a lot of questions coming in. So I think this is a good opportunity. And also, thank you for that. I'm processing all that. I have questions, but let's get to their questions first. Meredith at 7:03 p.m. Does moral scrupulosity OCD ever present primarily around social interactions? For example, obsessive thoughts one has hurt others by being unintentionally rude and awkward. Patrick, you nodded your head first.
All the time. Absolutely. What might I have said wrong? What might I have done wrong? Even though everybody at the party was laughing and seeming to have a good time, as I leave the party now, I'm just going to, just for the good of the night, I'm going to just review every conversation I had and and wonder if I had said something a little differently, might they have taken it differently? And maybe that would have made it even a better night than it was. And so maybe I should have done that. And I'm going to beat myself up. So here in this instance, nothing even has to go bad. In OCD, it could have been, but it could have gone better. And maybe that's just bad enough in and of itself that I didn't do the thing that could have made it even better than it was, even though it didn't turn out bad at all.
Yeah, I think a lot of social anxiety could also be understood as a form of moral scrupulosity, because it's often this fear of being negatively evaluated that drives social anxiety and social phobia, social avoidance. And if you get down into the discussion of like, what is it that you're really concerned is going to happen? It's often something like, this person is going to be off-put by my comments, or this person is going to, not like what I have to say, or this person's going to think I'm annoying and not want me there. And who cares, right? Like, just, so what? So that person has a terrible time, like, whatever, just be yourself, and that person can be themselves. And if they're unhappy, they're responsible for their own happiness. Well, no, that sounds very immoral. I need to care about the happiness of every individual in this social event. And if I just for a moment put myself first, then I'm committing the greatest moral scrup sin there is. So best I not go to the party, or at least if I go, I better ruminate about it a lot.
Take it out of a party for a minute. Imagine if I am responsible for the happiness of everyone else. I can't play sports anymore, because if I beat the other team, then, well, there's a lot of really disappointed fans of the other team. And I might have been the person who caused that, because I scored the winning goal. But if I lose, I've got a lot of people who love my team who are then very sad and disappointed that we lost. So maybe it's best just not to play at all. And therefore I won't be responsible for anybody having a bad night because one team won and one team lost.
Like, it's funny when I go to like my kid's basketball game and someone on the other team scores and all of the parents clap. Not me.
I also relate to what Meredith is saying. I that's probably one of the OCD things that are present a lot in my life. And what I find is, for me anyway, I care less about strangers and more about just important people in my life. That's where I worry that I may have been unintentionally rude or awkward. Family a little less, but mostly around business or things that could impact my career or things that I greatly value. So that's where I find myself if I send a text or I just did a live stream earlier today and said something really inappropriate accidentally, but like I hung up going, oh my God, she's never going to have me on again. That was ridiculous. But I guess that wasn't an OCD. I really did say something stupid, but regardless, but I totally relate to that, Meredith. And for me, it circles around people that are really important or I deem have some sort of greater value in my life. But John's right. The more you let go and try not to control their feelings or how they feel about it, the easier it gets. But it's really hard to do, especially as I say, the stakes rise and whatever is possibly at risk of losing that. So I relate to that.
The tendency, and you kind of highlighted it there, Ethan, is to overestimate how much people are thinking about you at all.
Yeah,
right? You're thinking about them a lot because you really do care. And then when you think you might have been unintentionally rude or awkward, then you feel really bad. But your assumption is that really bad feeling is justified because they must be really offended because you're sort of projecting your concern with them onto them back at you. They're really concerned with what Ethan Smith said, as opposed to they might be thinking something like, well, that joke didn't land perfectly, but I know Ethan, he's a funny guy, right? And then forgot about it after that. But in your mind, it's, I can't believe what he said. I'm going to spend all day thinking about it, because you're going to spend all day thinking about it. So that's the tendency.
Yeah, and then you send it, and then you send a text and you go, hey, sorry about earlier. And they're straight up like, what are you talking about? I have no clue what you're talking about.
What do you mean?
Now.
What does that mean? Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. So let's move on. I had another thought, but yes, absolutely. Let's go to Talia Johnson at 7:10 p.m. Is moral scrupulosity harder to treat with ASD teens that have rigid thinking? Great question. John, do you want to?
I couldn't speak to the entire population, but it's certainly been my experience that, the more rigid, more concrete the thinking, the more you're going to be prone to, this is what good people do, and here's the script that I follow for being a good person. Oh, I did something that didn't follow the script, therefore I'm a bad person. And sometimes getting caught up in that script of, this is what bad people do, now I must be a bad person who sits here and feels bad. So I think it does make it more difficult, like it would with any kind of OCD. what I see, and Patrick, you can help me out here, but what I see in people I've worked with on the spectrum is that without that concrete script for how to behave and how to think, it's like they're just being flung out into space and say, good luck, and most people feel more tethered.
Well, ASD almost adds another level of, and another idea that there is a perfect and a right way to do things. So now you have OCD, which tells you that, and you have ASD, which tells you that, and it's a double whammy in this kind of experience of it, where one may be focused on doubt, another might be focused on safety, right? So a lot of people that I've worked with who are on the autism spectrum disorder do things in very certain ways because there's so much going on in their head about how they kind of view the world that doing things in these certain ways means that it's safe. I've done it this way, it's turned out okay, so I have to do it that way because it's safe. Now add OCD onto it, and what if OCD says to do something different than my ASD says to it, because this is the safe way, but this seems to be the morally right way to do it. Now, there can be so much internal conflict then that can go on in those types of situations as well.
Thank you. That's fantastic. Actually, I love some of these folks. They were on my earlier broadcast and they were saying, no, the joke was funny. You were great, Ethan.
Don't reassure
me. Have you learned nothing? Okay. Nancy Miller at 7:14 p.m. When part the obsession is the thought, quote, I may be danger to others that makes me a bad person, do you recommend including in the willful exposure exercise the thought, maybe I'm a bad person?
Of course.
I think, I don't know, Patrick, I might disagree here. I don't think
okay.
so. I'm a little bit more flexible on that one, only because I'm very conscious of the tendency for people to compulsively self-punish. And so when you're doing exposures to morality, and let's
sure.
say if you're doing an imaginal exposure and you're writing a script about how you did all these terrible things, if that script devolves into I'm a pig, I'm disgusting, I'm terrible, I'm a bad human being, what can happen there sometimes is that self-punishment becomes the ritual. And the byproduct of the script is just depression. It's not learning to tolerate uncertainty. It's not learning to sit with your uncomfortable feelings. It's beating yourself up, which is not the point of a script. So I think certainly if you have the thought, could I be a bad person? It would be okay to be like, maybe, I don't know. But I do think it requires a little bit of nuance. How are you using that? There's also this concern about just the term bad person. I mean, what we're trying to learn here is that there really is no such thing. There are people who do many bad things and people who do a few bad things. And that's how we should be describing these people. Once we get into the black and white, this person's good and this person's bad, we're kind of playing OCD's game. We should probably avoid the terminology if we can. But sometimes we can't. And sometimes the exposure is, yep, I'm a bad person. Here I am, bad person at the gas station, bad person at the restaurant, bad person.
Right. Yeah, I would agree with John that I wouldn't want to do it, like you said, John, as a form of punishment and to put myself down. I would just like to think of it more in terms of if there are some people throughout the day who might think of me as that, then I'm going to have to be okay with the knowledge that that could happen. And I'm never going to know what everyone else's opinion of me is. Now, you'll notice that moral scrupulosity says pretty much everyone else's opinion of you is you could have done better, right? And this kind of even goes to the original definition of scrupulosity, which kind of comes from that idea of you got a little stone in your shoe and it's this little annoyance. And it even takes on what I as we cross over into religious a little bit, that the original idea of sin wasn't you're going to go to hell and you're awful and horrible. It's you missed the mark. And so in religious scrupulosity, it's no longer you miss the mark. It's awful, bad, horrible things. And in moral scrupulosity, it's not you miss the mark either. It's people think you're bad or something. So, and maybe there are people who think you're bad, but is that going to limit the rest of your life and you doing anything because somebody might think that about you? I sure would hope not. I mean, I know that there's some patients that I've treated in the past who said they didn't like me, or maybe they didn't like my style or something like that. Should I stop all therapy going forward because there have been some people who didn't like me? John would say yes, but otherwise, maybe.
Well, so, and we've all had patients too, where they might espouse a political or religious viewpoint that we find kind of morally offensive, and as clinicians, we're not like, well, I'm not gonna treat this person anymore. They're bad, right? It's no, I'm this person's a human being with their experience, and I'm here to help them with their OCD. And it's not people don't turn on a dime just because they reveal something about themselves that you happen not to agree with. It'll become this other thing.
Mhm.
Thanks, Jon and Patrick. And we can all agree that Patrick's headphones are cool, because Pavitt said you have cool headphones. If they're Bose.
They are.
They're a Bose. Pavitt, we have a winner. Hi, Pavitt. It's good to see you. I have to say, yesterday at Grief Town Hall, Pavitt really disclosed some super personal stuff, and we all spoke on it. And I think she's super brave and loved and fantastic. That's all I want to say about that. Okay. Anyway, so thank you for being here and advocating for yourself as always. I know it's late in London. So these aren't questions per se, but they're worth bringing up. So you don't need to bring them up, Jess. But Tina mentioned, I swear sometimes my brain is always on scan mode for things that I have done wrong. She said, oi, but I think that's at 7:17 p.m. And I think that's a great thing. And I would the only reason I wanted to bring that up, and I think maybe Pat or Jon might speak to that a little bit, but it's this idea of, can we let our brains be on scan mode and do what we need to do anyway, and let our brains kind of chatter or scan. It's not necessarily bad that your brain is doing its thing. Do we have to judge that? So
Right. Do you have to pay attention to it all the time?
Right.
Yeah, I would say the difference is, are you aware that it's scanning because that's what your brain does, and your attitude is like, oh, always scanning for problems,
Funny brain.
Or when you become aware of the scanning, do you then hop on the scan and participate and help the brain? Let me scan harder, right? In which case that would be compulsive, right? So that's the thing you want to resist. You can't always control what your brain is conditioned to do habitually, looking for problems. It's coming at it from a pretty honest place. It's trying to keep you from being hurt, and over time it's been conditioned to think that this is one way to do that. So you can't really blame your brain, but when you catch your brain doing it, you could either say, okay, fine, or you could ask it to stop. But the thing you don't want to do is help it do this thing that is further conditioning you to further look for problems.
I mean, every form of OCD is scanning, right? Is there a contaminant around? Are there things that are not at 90 or 45-degree angles? Did I pray enough? There's always scans that are going out there. So it just depends on how OCD has manifested in you of what you're scanning for.
Absolutely. And yeah, sorry, that was good. I'm just talking to myself. It's fine. So Eric Broach at 7:18 p.m. Long day.
There's help for that.
Seriously. Eric Broach at 7. My friend from Houston, Eric, at 7:18 p.m. What is the connection between moral scrupulosity and compulsive negative self-talk? For example, repeating "I hate myself" as a mantra.
I mean, I think that the connection is they're connected. That's what it is. I think that first of all, recognizing that negative self-talk is a compulsion is huge. A lot of people don't have that insight, and it takes a long time for them to develop that insight, to understand that it's not always just this automatic thing that, like, I have these negative thoughts about myself. Like the scanning can give me an automatic thing. Sometimes it's that, but it is often I am saying negative things to myself with intention to make myself feel a certain way, to get away from this uncertainty as to whether or not I deserve to be punished. So I think recognizing that and pivoting to self-compassion in the moment, spontaneously, is not only just a generally good idea, but it's also a great act of exposure. Here I am being fair and reasonable with myself, and sitting with this idea that maybe I'm imperfect like everybody else, but I'm doing the best I can. And what would be helpful right now is, instead of ruminating on it and beating myself up, I got to get back to this show I was watching because I'm missing it because I'm in my head, right? And that's a huge exposure because, the OCD thinks you're supposed to be working on this project of perfecting yourself, and you're just watching television. How dare you?
Mm-hmm. And the other piece, and I was kind of thinking this earlier when I leaned in, you asked if I was going to say anything, but it's come up now twice, so let's do it, is OCD is always telling you these things as a goal to hopefully make you better. I mean, it's kind of like, if I was following behind you all day long and telling you of every mistake you made, but I said, but I'm lovingly doing it, Ethan, just to help you improve your performance, you would want to punch me in the face or call the cops on me. Well, OCD is doing the exact same thing constantly. I mean, there's I've described it like this. OCD is telling you a lie, which is, I'm your best friend and biggest advocate. So I'm going to constantly tell you everything that you screw up or that you could potentially screw up, so that it'll always be at top of mind. So you'll always be watching for it, so that therefore you'll never actually do it, because I've reminded you all the time to keep an eye out for it.
Because I love you.
Because
in and a creepy way.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
So thank you, Eric, and thank you, Jon and Patrick. Lizzie says, I can relate. My brain is doing that a lot right now, which is the scanning. This is a great question. I know Meredith asked one, but I think Patrick, if you could just quickly explain, because it's this was actually a game changer for me. And just, can you explain, sorry, Jess, at 7:19 p.m., Meredith asked, can you explain thought action fusion, how it relates, and its relationship to OCD symptoms?
Sure. Well, the idea is that a thought is as bad as an action. So thinking something is just as bad as doing it. And boy, there's a whole history of this and cultural aspects to it as well. Links all the way back to over 1,000 years ago, in the way religion looked at doing confession and all sorts of things. But there are some cultures that have far less of this than others, but it's pretty apparent, at least in the US, that, and very kind of Northern European cultures as well too, this idea that thinking something is just as bad as doing it, and that we can be punished for thought crimes, and because thoughts are as bad as actions.
Yeah, I think the thought action fusion actually comes in two forms. One is probability type and the other is morality type. So probability type is, if I have this thought too many times, it will become an action. And so I need to make sure I don't have this thought too many times, because it would be wrong to allow this action to happen. And the morale, and that's usually associated with a lot of guilt, right? Oh no, I had the thought again. What have I done? And then morality type is, the having of the thought is the bad action. I'm a bad person because I thought it would be, funny to kick a person on the street. I didn't do anything, but I had the thought, and then I had the thought that it would be funny, and now I'm a bad person. And then that's of course associated with shame, which is this idea that I as a whole am bad, as opposed to I did a bad thing.
Thank you, Meredith and Jon. Brian Olson at 7:20 p.m. I've decided to not say anything at this point. I'm just going to go straight to thank you in the question, because words are not, everything is weird. So I'm going to just live with the uncertainty that I am strange tonight, and that there's help for me somewhere. So Brian Olson at 7:20 p.m. Jess, what is a good way to tell whether a behavior, oh wait, did I already read this one? Oh, no. See, this is why I shouldn't be allowed to be on here right now. What is a good way to tell whether a behavior comes from moral scrupulosity or high sensitivity that isn't related to OCD?
Not it.
Yeah. Okay. Well, a couple of things. I mean, the first question would be, does it really matter? And taking a look at it more of, is it interfering in your life? And if it is, then why continue to do it? And if this debate within your head is trying to figure that out, I'd call that something that OCD would love to get you into as well too. I mean, if OCD can get you in the weeds of something so that you don't actually ever go and do something, but constantly even get you to wonder what the reason you might be doing is. Now, am I doing this because of OCD, or am I doing it for a high sensitivity that I need to do things the right way or something like that? All of that is loved by OCD, because it constantly wants you to be thinking all of these things instead of actually engaging in something. So one thing that we might say again is, does that actually matter? Why not just do the behavior and play out the consequences and see where it goes, instead of, before we do anything, having to always know exactly what reasons or why I have thought about even doing the behavior, or might actually do the behavior in the first place.
Just to piggyback on that, it's not about what you do. It's about how you relate to the uncertainty around doing that thing. So the question is how to tell if the behavior, if I'm doing something I don't need to do, like apologizing to somebody when maybe I didn't really offend them, how do I know if that's me being morally scrupulous, or if I'm just very sensitive to this person's feelings? And it's not about the apology any more than, it's not about whether or not you wash your hands. It's, what is the purpose of it? Is it to get certain, or is there some other function? Right. So if it's to get certain, if you can't imagine not doing it, and you need to have that certainty, and you're going to go nuts if you don't get that certainty, then you might make the guess that it's OCD, and then you might make the guess that you could approach it from an ERP angle and maybe make a different choice. But But Patrick's right in that you don't want to get lost in the weeds trying to get certainty about whether or not you're doing it for certainty. And so at the end of the day, you have to just make a guess. But the difference between OCD and just being sensitive is not the behavior, it's the way you relate to the uncertainty around that behavior.
I'm going to throw in a question. When it comes to OCD, and it comes to the feelings around OCD and the anxiety, why is it so much that why isn't really important?
Why in terms of?
Why do I feel this way? Why is this? Why is this happening? Why? All these questions, and we've all done it. Those of us that have OCD, we're analyzing. We're looking for the why. Well, why do I feel this way? And why do I want to do this? And why do I?
I can answer that question for you if you want.
I'll keep talking. I'll let you know when you can answer. I'm not done rambling. Go ahead.
Very simple. Because you have obsessive compulsive disorder. That's the answer, right? So in so many ways, I mean, that is the nature of OCD, is to constantly get you to question everything and to never feel certainty about anything. But why do I have it? I mean, here's the deal. I could put a panel of 100 experts in front of you who give you all of their opinions, and you're still going to say, but why do I have it? Why though? Why is it? And it's the nature of OCD that this is the way that OCD works. Now,
but why is it? Go ahead, Jim. Go ahead.
That may not feel like an acceptable answer to you, but it's the best answer that we have.
But the why is important sometimes in analyzing other things in life.
I think if the question is, why am I having this thought, feeling, or sensation? Why am I having this internal experience? The question's inherently flawed because the implication is that there is some sort of causal relationship between you and the thoughts, feelings, and sensations. So if I could go full mindfulness on you, I would say these experiences are simply arising. The question of why is the wrong question. Your job is to simply observe that, not to figure out why. And sure, there's good discussions worth having, like, how was I taught about coping with uncertainty by my parents? Maybe that would explain why I have this difficulty with coping with uncertainty in this area or that area. There are some whys, I agree with you, Ethan, that are kind of interesting to understand, but they don't actually affect the treatment. They might affect your attitude about the treatment, but they don't actually affect what you have to do, which is really learn to internalize this notion that your thoughts, your feelings, and your sensations are objects of attention arising in consciousness. And to ask why, it's kind of like looking down at a pot of stew and it's boiling, and you see a piece of corn come up and you see a piece of potato come up, and you want to know why the corn came up and not the celery or something like that, right? Well, you don't need that. There's no answer to that question. There might be like a profound physics answer to that question, but it says nothing about the stew and how it tastes. It has nothing to do with anything that really matters. It's just what's arising.
There is no celery in the stew, John.
That's
when you start your car, do you have to know why it started? And do you have to go in and take the engine apart and see how all of the components work together and read about it to understand it? Or can you just accept the fact that I turn the key and my car goes on, and sometimes I don't, so I take it to mechanic, they fix it? Well, maybe in some way therapists for OCD are kind of like the mechanic. They're going to help you fix things that aren't working the way that they do for most other people.
The other problem with why questions, of course, is that they tend to only lead to other why questions. So if you were to sort of get down to using Patrick's example, why the car started when I turned the key, what's next? Why do I have a car? Well, to go places. Why do I need to go places? Well, because it just never ends.
And the reason I brought that up, and some of the underlying reasoning for these questions that people are asking is why. And also, I know for me in my own journey with OCD, when I let go of why, that's when I really started to make strides, because it's the analytical behavior behind the OCD that really gets you bogged down. And I use a similar example, Patrick, in saying, like, in engaging in treatment is the less we ask why, the more engaged we can be. And that's the very thing. I always use the example of, if you hand someone with OCD a cell phone as part of their exposure and say, make the call, someone with OCD will go, well, how's it work? And let me see. And why does it work this way? And when does this beam to the satellite, as opposed to just take the phone and call it? Why really complicates the process. And so I just thank you. I really wanted to have a conversation on why, and I appreciate that. Megan Winston, this is not a question. She said, I've been obsessing about whether it was moral for me to have liked a Facebook post or not for over a week and spent hours on this. And I can definitely relate to some of that behavior, and hopefully some of what we're talking about can help you make some of those decisions as to whether that's how you want to spend your time. Jeanine at 7:21 p.m. Jess, question: have you noticed an identity crisis and shift in someone's sense of self due to the impact of moral scrupulosity over time? She gives an example if you'd like to hear it.
Sure.
Okay. Someone has someone has jealous or mean thoughts towards someone that are not characteristic and feels deeply intrusive, and then they believe that they actually might have issues as if it were a shadow thing and treat it as such. Long story short, they begin to think they are turning into something and someone they are not.
Yeah.
So it's like an emotional contamination, sort of fear of becoming something that you weren't meant to be because you mishandled some experience, some thought or feeling. Yeah.
I think. Go ahead, Patrick.
No, I was just going to say, we hear that all the time with, well, does that mean that I'm a pedophile, or does that mean that I'm the opposite orientation I am, or something like that? There's no different than any of those discussions we have had around that stuff.
And I think maybe she's also asking, like, over time, can it eventually wear you down to actually become the thing that you're afraid of, or become the immoral person as it chips away at your moral fiber?
I'll let Jon take that one. I know what he's going to say. So
I think that's what she's asking.
What happens is you begin to believe the junk in your head, right? If every time you see a spam message, you click on it and say important, send to inbox, right? Then the algorithm is going to eventually start sending you a lot of spam, and it's going to show up in your inbox and seem just as important. And that's what we're doing with OCD. We're taking junk mail and we're saying, oh, let me open this up. Oh, this seems important, as opposed to just, ignoring it or letting it go, right? And that's a lot of what ERP is. It's sort of taking all this junk in our inbox and treating it like junk so that the algorithm learns to sort of put it in the back of our mind instead of the forefront of our mind. But what can happen is your insight goes down over time. If the more let's say you have a jealous thought, and that's out of character because you don't want to be a jealous person. And then you spend a lot of time obsessing and ruminating over that jealous thought and then telling yourself you're a bad person. You're going to start to believe that you're a jealous and bad person. It's not going to necessarily make you a jealous and bad person. It might make you grumpy. It might make you hard to be around, right? It might impact your behavior. But all OCD kind of turns you into the thing you don't want to be if you do enough compulsions, right? The metaphor, if you wash your hands too much, you end up getting infections because you've scraped off all the protective oils from your skin. So if you beat yourself up too much, you're not going to be a very pleasant person to be around, which is, you're beating yourself up in the hopes that you'd be a better person, right? Mm-hmm. So the only other thing I just want to add to that is when you're in a situation where you're having a thought that's out of character, that's not a problem. You treat it like it's a problem, you can start to believe that it's a problem, but it's not a problem to have a jealous thought. It'd be a problem to, sabotage somebody's, career because you didn't want them to be successful, sure. But to simply be aware that a thought arose in your consciousness that doesn't fit in perfectly with your autobiography, that's not an actual problem. That's just that's a thought. You're allowed to have that thought. You're allowed to have that jealous thought. That doesn't make you a jealous person. It just makes you a person who had a jealous thought. Sorry, Patrick, you wanted to say something?
Yeah,
I would just say that all OCD changes in some ways yourself, and you, by following OCD, I haven't met yet anyone who says, the more I followed OCD, really the better person I felt that I've become, no matter what the type of OCD was. So,
and it's interesting because I actually lived with an abusive roommate who are actually friends now, strangely, but he when I lived with him, he was constantly belittling me, constantly telling me that, I should give up my career, that I'm wasting my time, that I'm not good enough, I'm not talented enough, I'm not smart enough. And I lived with him for 2 years. And by the time I left, I believed everything that he said and believed it to the point where I was actually not doing as well in the things that I used to be good at. And I started to question, like, oh, maybe he's right. Over time and working with my therapist, it was like I was undermining myself because I was buying into the thoughts that were being put in my head. I mean, I put my thoughts in my head, but I was letting them impact, and I became Did I really become the things that he had said? No. The fiber of who I was and what I had to offer the world didn't change at all. It was simply the thoughts in my head and my belief in them. And in a way, I could easily say that he was OCD. Yes, he was an external force in my situation, but I can understand how that can feel very real and how it can impact long term. So,
I had a patient once that I thought was really interesting. He described OCD as Stockholm syndrome. I fell in love with the thing that's kidnapped me, and I do whatever I can to make it happy.
Yeah, that happens a lot, and sometimes the people who struggle with that are very resistant to treatment because you're asking them to abandon the only thing that they think has kept them safe. They're the hostage who provided them with food, provided them with shelter. Yeah, they tortured me, but at least it's the devil I know.
Mm-hmm. And why a lot of the podcasts I do on Wednesdays with OCD comes in, I'm afraid to not have OCD because I don't know what I'll be like without it, because I only know what it's like to have it.
It's scary. I mean, as someone that was born with it and didn't get treatment until 30 and really thought that it was who I was as a person, it's definitely scary to look at the future and not know. As John said, devil, it was painful. It was miserable. But I was scared to know who I was without it. And I was scared that I would lose the, I was really scared that I would lose the, I can't think of the word, but how people were treating me, the allowances that I was getting, people catering to my obsessions and enabling and the reassurances and all of that stuff. And how would I ever take care of myself, or how would I ever be able to be independent on my own? That the whole thing was so scary.
Right.
So I completely relate to that. Nancy Miller at 7:25 p.m. Any recommendation? Oh, hi, Lisa Coyne. We love you. Okay. Any recommendations on working with people who are stuck, unwilling to do exposure because they can't know if this really is OCD or if they really are a terrible, dangerous person? Go ahead, Patrick.
Well, I think that goes along with that last question that we had. It was very, very similar kind of thing that we're never going to, if we have OCD, we're probably never going to feel that we aren't a terrible person until we start doing ERP to allow ourselves to actually scientifically test out where does OCD come in and where can I actually live my life. So OCD is going to not want to go away. So it's going to very significantly convince you really are a bad person. Keeping me around is the only thing that prevents you from being the worst person in the world. Don't do therapy, and I'll do all that I can to keep you safe and protect you from becoming the worst person you could possibly be.
Anything to add, John?
I mean, what is a terrible, dangerous person? What does that even mean?
Yeah.
So if that's what's keeping you stuck, I think, at least from a clinician's standpoint, you might want to do a little bit of work on just challenge the notion that you think that you're afraid of this thing that you're assuming exists, and I'm not entirely sure it exists. I can't tell you it doesn't exist, but I'm not entirely sure that it is. And you're saying you're willing to risk everything. You're willing to risk all forms of satisfaction, all forms of joy, all meaningful relationships, your work, your creativity, your art. You're willing to risk all of that because of your fear of being this thing that we're not 100% sure exists. And if you do the math on that, I'm not sure that's going to work out for you. Why did you come to an OCD therapist? Some part of you came to an OCD therapist because you think you have OCD, right? Maybe not all of you, but some part of you. Let's work with that part of you, the part of you that's not convinced the amount of effort you're putting into this problem equates to the reality of the problem itself.
Thank you, John. Just want to point out, so Christine, you don't need to post this, Jess. She writes at 7:26 p.m. I don't have moral scrupulosity or fear of germs, but due to COVID restrictions, it's made me afraid to leave my house because of the less trips out in public. OCD is much more aggressive when I push to go anywhere. Trying mindfulness, but OCD is still overwhelming. I just want to say that's valid. I think that's everybody's, faces some sense of that. But I would say that look at the opportunities to go out to sort of aggressively attack OCD. I mean, the whole point of ERP is to draw OCD out so we can then kind of punch it in the face. And I think that those are opportunities to get out. If you're not white knuckling it, if you have an opportunity to really engage in exposure response prevention, that's not necessarily a bad thing. And if you're not sure what I'm talking about or you haven't heard of ERP, I would encourage you to go to IOCDF.org and you can check out more information on ERP and also just worth pointing that out. So this is a great question. Jasmine at 7:30 p.m. Carter, and I see your comment, by the way, and I really, really appreciate it. And please feel free to email if you have additional questions around that comment as well. Jasmine at 7:30 p.m., what considerations do you take with moral scrupulosity learned from cultural teachings, practices, and navigate conversations with clients and range exposures without offending the client's culture?
Well, it's imperative for any therapist to understand what kind of the normative practice are within whatever culture. And my only goal when I'm doing ERP with people is to get them to act toward those normative practices and not do what OCD wants them to do and take them above and beyond to the nth degree. So we have to, no matter who we are, really take the time to get to know a patient and what culture they're coming from so that we can really work with them on finding those normative practices. That's how I look at it.
Just like with religious scrupulosity,
yeah,
my goal in working with a religious person, with a person who comes from a philosophy that is not one that I subscribe to, is to help them get what they want. You know, what they want maybe is to be closer to God, but what they're doing is not getting them closer to God, ruminating and obsessing over every little detail of scripture and avoiding going to church because it's too scary and compulsively praying when you're not really even part of that prayer, but you're just saying these things by rote, right? So my job is not to explain your religion to you, but for you to explain your religion to me and then help me help you get more connected to it, to pull the OCD out of it. So the same applies to moral scrupulosity, right? You tell me what you think the moral code is that you're supposed to be following, because I guarantee what you're doing that brought you to my office is not getting you closer to it. It's bringing you further from it. Let me help you get closer to it with a strategy that's more likely to work, more likely to make you feel confident, which is meaning this is going to go my way, and self-confident, meaning whether or not it goes my way, I know I can cope with it. Let me help you get both of those confidences back when it comes to your morality.
Yep.
Thank you, John and Pat. I know, Brian, you already asked a question, but I think this is a great question to ask because it kind of works into this idea of certainty and looking for exact instructions. Brian at 7:31 p.m. asks, how can a person with OCD moral scrupulosity figure out whether something they're doing is caused by their OCD? Is there a question they could ask themselves? I think we could apply this to pretty much any decision we wonder is OCD or not OCD. What's the quick answer, John?
Is there a question they could ask them to determine if it's OCD? Wait, I just want to make sure I understand the question. Can a person with OCD moral scrupulosity figure out whether something they're doing is caused by their OCD? Is there a question they can ask themselves?
I think they're just asking if is there a way to determine is it OCD related or not?
Yeah, I mean, again, I would try not to ask too many questions and make a guess and move forward. But if you have to ask a question, it might be, can I imagine moving forward without doing this behavior? That might help you recognize whether or not it's a compulsion. And is this behavior grounded in a need for certainty, or is it actually connected to an underlying value, something I genuinely care about? Not just closing the loop, but actually part of a larger valued behavior. But get in quick and get out. Don't spend a lot of time trying to make sure that your answers are correct.
Yeah, I don't know if John and Patrick would agree with me here, but I specifically tend to take a more direct approach in this type of question, especially, and again, I don't know where you are, Brian, in your process, but I know for a fact when I was in the process of treatment and not in maintenance and management, if it smelled or looked or tasted or quacked like a duck, it's a duck. So if I even have the inkling of a thought that, I wonder if this is OCD, I just assumed everything was OCD because why not? And then, as I moved a little bit further into maintenance and management and sort of successfully functioning with OCD, it's easier to differentiate the two voices. My OCD voice has a very different voice than my Ethan value voice, and I can usually pick it out pretty well. And so I would just assume it's all OCD. Be willing to make mistakes, be willing to be a terrible person and move forward anyway.
I like that. And I think also that the consequences of being wrong about that guess are not as bad as the consequences about being wrong about it being OCD. Meaning if you're saying it seems like OCD, I'm going to treat it like OCD, and it turns out you're wrong, you'll cope with that. But if it seems like OCD and you decide not to treat it like OCD, you're going to have a much harder time coping with the consequences of that.
That's a great point. Laura Joe at 7:32 p.m. How much can the technique of somatic experiencing help with the ERP, i.e. introducing a good, acceptable sensation that counters the sensation of guilt? John or Pat?
I'm not well versed in somatic experiencing, so
Nor am I.
Specifically, so. my instinct would be to say to assume that trying to replace a negative feeling with a positive one could be a compulsion, but in the case of moral scrupulosity, it could also be an exposure, because the compulsion might be to make yourself feel bad, so that you know that you're moral. So actually enjoying being who you are and sitting with that joyful feeling when there's a part of you that says, yeah, but aren't you a bad person? Nah, shut up. I'm in the middle of enjoying this. That might be an exposure. So I think it really just depends on understanding the person that you're working with. I don't know that there's one right answer to that question.
Yeah, that's the issue with this. The motivation could go one way or the other depending on that. Sometimes you want people to sit with feeling good because that's an exposure, and sometimes you want people to sit with not feeling great because that's an exposure too. So.
Absolutely. Thank you. We've also got a lot of comments on Atari, so thank you, Patrick. In fact, Christine said before Atari, there was a table tennis video game, dots back and forth. Yes, that was called Pong.
Pong.
And my aunt had a Pong machine in her house, and I thought it was amazing. Okay, so this is an interesting question, and I think it brings up a broader answer, but I will ask it. Jeanine, at 7:34 p.m., what type of exposures can I suggest to my boyfriend who's constantly worried about giving the wrong perception? He doesn't want to be perceived by me or others as lazy because he is taking unemployment. I'll just want to say this, and then I'll turn it over to Jon and Patrick. I would say that in general, I would turn to your therapist, clinician, or provider for for advice on, and if he's currently not with a therapist, you definitely don't want to be the ERP police in his life. You can definitely learn ways to not enable him or reassure him and things like that. But you want to remain in the girlfriend role and let the therapist and clinician do what they do best. But with that, I will turn over to Jon and Pat if they have suggestions.
Well, can we ever really know how anybody perceives us, right? And so OCD will always jump to the worst case scenario of telling us how everybody perceives us. And I like to get people to consider the idea of, what if you go with your second thought? Your first thought's almost always going to be the worst case scenario you can possibly come up. But very often our second thought isn't quite as bad. So try going with the second thing that pops into your head and not just trusting the first thing that always pops in your head, because that first thing that always pops in your head is almost always that worst case scenario.
I think there are lots of ways to do exposure to if the fear is, if the fear is of being perceived as lazy, exposures that could work in some situations might be, broadcasting your laziness in some way, like posting a picture on your social media of you, kicking back, doing nothing, reading a book or whatever. I don't know that would be an appropriate exposure for this specific individual who might not want to advertise that he's in a difficult economic situation, having to take unemployment, like a lot of people right now. That's your private experience. You don't have to share that, and it's not compulsive to avoid sharing it. I would say that sometimes the fear is of being lazy or of becoming a lazy person, and so the compulsion is to be overproductive. And so exposures to literally being lazy can be fun to prescribe for some of my clients. You have to spend an hour and you have to, watch this trash television, and you're not allowed to learn anything. And then I want you to come and tell me next week what you didn't learn, and that can be very difficult for people who are wired to think, if I'm not always producing, I'm not always contributing, then I'm a bad person. But, that's not true. That's just black and white thinking.
Thanks, Jon and Pat. And thank you, Jeanine, for the question. I wasn't trying to be hard. It's just, it's always important to seek professional. And also, he needs to know that he's doing an exposure. You can expose him, and if he doesn't have any insight as to what an exposure is, it could be kind of not particularly helpful. Meg Winston at 7:37 p.m. Great question. What should teachers keep in mind when teaching students with scrupulosity?
Well, potentially a couple of things that they're probably, maybe a few things first, maybe to look out for. They could be the kid who's always the first one done with the test because they have to look really good in front of everyone else. And that's one way to look good and smart or perfect in front of other people. There's potentially some other ideas that getting an answer wrong isn't a failure, right? It's a learning opportunity. But if you're so hard on yourself about the idea that you might have made a mistake, and what does that say about you? Or will the teacher feel bad because obviously then it means that they didn't teach you well enough, that you didn't learn it, and then now you're worried that you're going to make them feel bad because you didn't get the right answer because it means they didn't teach you well. Getting people just to recognize that we are all here to learn and to be open to mistakes can be a very important learning tool as well too. And kind of, I would say, in a classroom, engender that kind of experience for people where everybody, whether they get the answer right or not right, offers us an opportunity to learn something.
Great. Thank you, Pat. Well, we'll keep going. I'm going to try to get to as many questions as possible. Emily Black at 7:40 p.m. I'm curious about the relationship between OCD and disassociation. Are they related processes? It seems like the nervous system in a state of mixed arousal. First of all, what is disassociation for those that may not know? And then we can answer her question. John, do you want to take it?
No, let's let Patrick do it. He's the doctor here.
So with dissociation, it would be a feeling of feeling detached from yourself or your environment, maybe floating above your body, not being fully engaged in the experience that you are. It can be a very powerful tool if we find ourselves in a very uncomfortable situation to not deeply or fully encode that situation so that it won't kind of be with us throughout the rest of our life. And it can be very common in panic symptoms as well, too. So if somebody's OCD gets them to the point of panicky because they're so caught up in something, dissociation could be something that they jump to. And it could therefore become a safety behavior because it allows me to kind of escape the feelings and also the situation that I find myself in that's very triggering for me. So from a therapeutic point of view, what we might want to do is purposely work on triggering some of these sensations that come along with dissociation to show people that you can handle the things that lead to dissociation. You don't need to jump to dissociation as the way to handle the thing that is uncomfortable.
I see it come in two forms that Patrick kind of identified both of them. One is where the brain pulls you out of the situation because you're overloaded. And the other is when you kind of dive into that experience to get out of a very uncomfortable situation. So when doing ERP, when you think about things possibly being on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being totally easy and 10 being the hardest thing you could ever do, I'm always looking for exposures that are in that 6, 7, 8 range because I want it to be difficult enough that the learning will take place, but not so difficult that dissociation takes place because the learning won't take place there either, right? If you're at a 10 the whole time and you're really kind of checked out, then your brain's not a witness to the experience of getting through it. Then the brain hasn't learned anything, that we haven't really accomplished anything. So finding that sweet spot where it's just hard enough, but not so hard that we have to worry about dissociation. Some people are very quick to dissociate, so you might work with them differently than people who aren't.
I also like to add and appreciate, and hopefully Patrick can as well, is as daylight slowly disappears from John's life, he slowly looks like he's being interrogated, and I'm enjoying that.
Oh yeah, I don't have the lights on. I have my desk lamp on, but not the overhead light.
You're literally like, where were you on the night of December 34th?
I have no idea.
Yeah, exactly. We're going to just have why. I shouldn't ask why questions. Chris Tronson at 7:40 p.m. First of all,
hey, we know Chris Tronson. Hi, Chris.
We do know Chris Tronson. First of all, we love the three of you. I love the three of you, especially Ethan, you good-looking, sexy fox. Oh, thank you, Chris. I appreciate that. Second, I am with a client who doesn't feel comfortable using their personal Facebook. They ask, how do you handle a parent who is extremely religious and thinks that the exposures given are actually morally wrong? It's hard to decide to listen to either my therapist or mom. And then he adds, she's been educated by multiple therapists on OCD, but still won't budge.
Is this an adult, do we know, or a child, adult who lives at home, or a child?
How do you handle a parent who's extremely religious? I'm assuming then it's a child. Yeah.
Yeah, that's difficult because it's as a clinician, I know it's difficult to be in the position of saying you don't need to listen to your parents. I know nobody wants to be in that spot, but then of course, if the parent is advocating a position that's fundamentally contraindicative of getting better, that does put you in a bind.
Yeah, and sometimes they'll have parents that say, well, I've done this my whole life, and look, I turned out just fine, so you should do this as well, too. And they'll use their own kind of example as saying, this is proof that this works. And you know what? maybe it did work for that person, but it doesn't mean that it's going to necessarily work for anyone else or your child. And we as therapists aren't out here to kind of get people to go against tradition and values and family beliefs or religious beliefs, as we said earlier. We're here to take a look at if you're doing these certain types of things and they're working for you, great. But if you're doing these things and you're finding lots of consternation and tons of doubt and just feeling awful and horrible, why continue to do something like that? And my question in this situation is always a very simple one. If your best friend came up to you and said, this is how I'm feeling in this type of situation, these are the things that I feel like I'm forced to do, would you say to your best friend, that's a great idea? Or would you say, there might be another way?
Yeah, I like that. I would say too that exposures aren't really given. I mean, if they're done well, it's not like I'm coming up with the exposure and saying, do this and you're going to get better. And the exposures really should be and I'm sure they are if someone Chris is working with, but it should be a collaborative process. It should start with the client understanding that it would be a good idea to do this, that it would be helpful. Moral exposures are not acts of immorality. And of course, it really only matters what he thinks, what the client thinks is moral or immoral, not what any other person thinks. So mom's entitled to have her opinion, right or wrong. But the exposure should be generated from, I've worked on this with my therapist and I've come to the conclusion that the best way for me to overcome my OCD and be the healthiest contribution to society that I can be is to engage in this act. It's this exposure act that I'm going to engage in. So it's not, it might be scary. It might be in this like moral gray zone, but to the person doing it, it's not like, oh, we came up with an immoral thing to do, right? We're not breaking anybody's moral code. Mom has a different moral code, which is fine. Is she going to keep him from doing what he has learned is in his best interest? Or is she going to back off and recognize, well, you know what? He's a sentient being with his own process, and all I really want is for him to be well because I love him. It sounds like the mom's already been educated about OCD as much as possible. And so there might just be some discomfort that they're going to have to tolerate in the home. But if there's any part where the kid's able to say, my therapist wants me to do this or is making me do this or gave me this thing to do, that doesn't help that situation. The kid should really be thinking, this was my idea and it's a good one and I'm going to do it.
And I had a similar situation like this once that I was treating, and part of the issue was that the parent had obsessive compulsive personality disorders. So their concept of what was right or wrong was really not coming from anything other than this personality disorder based kind of view of the world. And then they were trying to, as people with OCPD would, put that onto everyone else and tell everyone else, this is the only way to be. And if you're not this, then you're bad or you're wrong. So And we can't confuse OCPD with OCD. They're two amazingly different types of things. But in the obsessive compulsive personality aspect, morality is one of the diagnostic criteria that you look at in OCPD. So I just wonder if maybe mom has some things that are going on as well, and then and that is driving some of the issues that are going on in the family as well, because people with OCPD are very persuasive into letting you know that you're wrong unless you do things the way they want it done.
And OCPD is?
Obsessive compulsive personality disorder.
Thank you,
I'm
Patrick.
curious as to what the exposures are that we're talking about. So Chris,
Yeah.
if you want to email us, I'd just be curious what it is that you're doing, because that might also inform us of a better answer.
Yeah, be interesting.
Crystal at 7:42 p.m. How do you handle parents who haven't gotten diagnosed with anxiety, though obviously live in fear, recognize their patterns as those I'm wanting to get away from?
Two questions in a row, but how to handle parents.
Yeah.
Well, I'll start by saying that I think when I got better and I came home, I quickly identified the level of OCD and anxiety in my own parents. And although I wasn't living with them, it was definitely aggravating and frustrating because I then wanted to help them and help them figure it out. And what I learned was I can communicate in a very compassionate way and point it out once or twice, but at the end of the day, it's up to them and I have to leave it alone because nothing good comes of it. But I'll turn it over to Jon and Pat.
I would just say that part of compassion is seeing people in their context and understanding that your parents, sure, maybe they live in fear and they have anxiety and there's they didn't start out that way, right? They were babies at some point, and then they grew into these fearful people. And you don't have to take that on. You can view yourself as an observer of that, and some of it might feel like it's sort of you're around it, so the negativity is getting in you, and you don't want to, and it can be toxic. But if you're approaching them with compassion, that might help take some of the pressure off of like, oh, these anxious people. No, it's more like my poor parents that are like, they're struggling. They don't understand that they don't need to live in fear. I don't need to adopt their attitudes, and that starts with self-compassion, right? You need a full tank in order to offer some to other people. So also recognizing, man, it's hard to be around my parents sometimes because they're so negative, and they're so anxious. All they talk about is their fears. It's hard. Yeah. Okay. Put your hand on your heart. Recognize. Yeah, it is hard. It's okay to think that. That will give you a nice buffer, so you don't have to actually take in their negative emotions. You can be an observer and, wish for them to suffer less.
And if there's behaviors that your parents are doing that you recognize aren't helping your parents, then those become behaviors that probably won't help you too. So you already have some examples of what behaviors don't work. And there's, the title of the book, Don't Try Harder, Try Different, is built around that. If you already know that something's not working, then why continue to try to do it and make it work if you already know it's not working? Right? I use the example sometimes. There's two ways to hammer in a nail. One, you could hold the nail like this, tap it in a little bit, and then when it's set, start pounding it in. The second way is put your thumb over the top and just whack the crap out of it until it goes down. Now, both will work. One just sucks a lot more than the other one. And people with OCD seem to pick the one that sucks more almost all of the time than choosing the one that is probably better and efficient and easier.
That's quite an image.
For sure it is. We are getting some great questions. I want to try to get to some people that haven't asked questions. Although Laura, I think you're tracking. Laura asked about the somatic experiencing. There have been some comments on that, and people have said that it's kind of counterintuitive to ERP from their ERP therapists. Although I'm not a doctor, but I did play one in 2003 on CSI Miami. I will say that, and Jon as well.
Jon was in a hospital on Grey's Anatomy once too.
Many things to talk about, but I will quickly say, though I'm not an expert like Jon or Patrick, I will say though that the feeling of discomfort is necessary to properly execute exposure response prevention. You have to feel that discomfort in order to habituate to it. So eliminating that sense of discomfort and anxiety really doesn't give you anywhere to go with ERP. It's just you feel, and it's so. I personally think that it might be counterintuitive, but again, I'm not a doctor. I just like to assert my opinion where it's not needed. Go, Ethan.
Ethan, I would agree. I agree with what you said, but I would still add that footnote that sometimes the uncomfortable thing is feeling good, is getting away with having had a bad thought and not punishing yourself for it. So I don't know enough about somatic experiencing to comment on whether or not that can be accomplished in that modality, but it is necessary to feel discomfort in order to habituate it, but not all discomfort feels like pain.
Right. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Which is what I was about to say when you interrupted me, Jon.
That's what you get when two people have played doctors on TV. They get into a fight with each other.
Exactly. Last question we'll throw out to Cassie. Cassie, hopefully you're still watching us. Thank you for all you do. 7:54 p.m. Any thoughts of explaining to others that not everything is moral scrupulosity? Like I have moral values as well, and sometimes people think everything, including my values, is OCD.
Yeah, well, 100%. Yeah. You're allowed to have beliefs, right? There's nothing wrong with them, and to fight for your beliefs and to stand up for them. But I like beliefs where I'm also okay if somebody disagrees with my beliefs, that I can still be friends with them, and I don't have to then question my beliefs because somebody has an opposite belief. And I also don't have this driving thing in me telling me, no, I have to have everybody believe the things that I believe, or else then my beliefs aren't valid. And that's where OCD, I think, would come in and really screw with beliefs.
I think it's really hard with any kind of OCD. It's like just because you're washing your hands doesn't mean you have contamination OCD. If you may also have contamination OCD, but that doesn't mean that this particular time someone saw you washing your hands, you were doing a compulsion. So I think it goes back to just the problem of people in general being too judgmental, and all we can do is be less judgmental of them and hope that that somehow creates a butterfly effect that makes the world a better place.
Thank you, John. There's some great questions throughout, and also thank you everybody for advocating for yourselves as always. So I encourage everyone to read through the comment thread because everybody has some great thoughts. If we didn't get to your question, you have some great questions here. Please don't hesitate to email the IOCDF at info@iocdf.org. You can address it to myself. You can address it to John. You can address it to Patrick, and they will make sure that we get it, and we'll answer your question and get it back to you. As always, I want to thank John and Patrick for joining us. Their expertise is always appreciated, as is their wisdom, kind-heartedness, and sense of humor. So thank you, Pat and John.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Also,
when
John,
are we doing part 3?
I think we'll
It would be
part
immoral not to.
It would be immoral not
It
to.
would be. It would be very immoral not to do so. Yeah.
Plus, we can't end on an even number. So, and with that, John needs to pay his light bill. So, anyway, as always, thanks. I feel like he's pedaling under the desk to keep the light on. You know.
That's great. Yeah, I like that.
So
John became Amish. It's actually a gas lantern.
Those darn kids. Okay. Anyway, lots of old references: Kentucky Fried Movie, Atari. Anyway, so as always, thank you for spending your Wednesday night with us. Just some quick housekeeping. Please check the calendar on the IOCDF website. For upcoming events, we'll definitely be having live streams next week. We're in the middle of finalizing them now. I also want to give some people mentioned John's book, a few of them actually, and finding it very helpful. So please check out either of John's books. Patrick's books are just so maybe. Yeah. But I will say I do want to give a shout out to NoCD if you're unfamiliar with it, and I'm sure Patrick is better describing it. But NoCD is available. It's an app it's a giant OCD community that's phenomenal. It's an app that is available in the App Store on Apple and Google Play. Not only do they have amazing OCD tools and a vibrant OCD community where you can get involved and engage with other OCD individuals with OCD, but they have a teletherapy service with ERP experts that Patrick oversees the training of. This is accessible now in 23 states. Is that correct?
Correct.
So it's affordable, it's effective treatment, and it's really fantastic. So if you live in an area that is hard to access treatment, or treatment you have just found to be not affordable right now, NoCD is a fantastic option and opportunity, and you're not sacrificing quality for cost. So that's it. We're really thankful for the work that Patrick and Stephen Smith, who is the CEO and founder of NoCD, are doing over there. So thank you guys.
Absolutely.
Last but not least, as we know, June is coming up. Normally, it is time for our Million Steps Walk. Unfortunately, due to COVID-19, we are doing a virtual Million Moves for OCD. This is a giant dance party that we'll be hosting on a date at a time that I didn't write down, but I'm sure it's a good date. It's next week. Just crap. What is it? Let me pull up my calendar quickly. Sorry to stall. It is June 27th at 2 p.m. Eastern. It will be the Million Moves for OCD. If you go to the website, which you can put the link to, we have a TikTok challenge. We have a dance challenge. If you'll be making videos, you can post them online. We have lots of cool judges, and winners of each of those video contests will be receiving free registration to the online conference this year. So there's some good prizes, as well as we'll be having a lot of fun and good conversation. So definitely mark that in your calendars. As always, I want to say thank you to Jess, who's behind the scenes, and thank you to the IOCDF. If you haven't, we're not done. Don't wave yet, Patrick. It's not over.
I'm waving at Jess.
Yeah.
Wave at Jess. Sorry, Jess.
Thank you, Jess.
Wave at Jess.
Thank you, Jess.
Thank you, Jess. Thank you, Jess. If you haven't already and want to be notified about all program the IOCDF is having over the next month, definitely be sure to subscribe and follow on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and Twitter. Again, thank you to John, who's about to be arrested, and Patrick. Thanks for spending your Wednesday night. As always, like I said, contact the foundation at info@iocdf.org. Have a wonderful night. Stay safe. Stay vigilant. Feel the feels. Don't let OCD off the hook. And we'll see you next time. And we look forward to a volume 3. We'll have to bring it to you. Good night.